Welcome to Alchemist X, Innovators Inside, the official podcast of Alchemist X, the corporate services division of the Alchemist Accelerator. Alchemist X operates corporate programs for spin-ins and spin-outs. Here on AXII, you'll follow host Rachel, head of Alchemist X, as she talks to corporate innovation's highest achievers and most compelling thought leaders. These are fly-on-the-wall conversations with leading practitioners in the field. They'll share their lessons learned so that you can accelerate your development. So sit back, relax, and get ready to level up.
Today, it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome Cindy Alvarez, author of Lean Customer Development, published in 2014, a book that I use and recommend in every single accelerator program that I run. Cindy is the director of customer research for GitHub, where she works to understand what helps developers collaborate, build effective solutions, and drive change within their organizations. She came to GitHub and Microsoft from Yammer, where she was director of user experience. Cindy's passionate about diversity and inclusion, supporting women, Black and Latinx people, and girls in tech. Cindy, I have to tell you that when I get folks to take your advice seriously and get outside of the building and talk to their customers, the results are absolutely transformative. So thank you for that book.
Of course, great. I'm always glad to hear that.
You are a leading voice in customer development right at this point in history where even the largest corporations are trying to remake themselves to be more customer-centric. Can you talk about the challenges of taking customer development beyond the software industry to banks, airlines, manufacturing companies, places like that?
Sure. I think one of the things we see is that there's an assumption that software has an advantage because it's faster to develop than a lot of other industries. I actually think that's not quite the nuance. It's that it's much easier to control the delivery and to have more insight into how it's being used because you can look at actual metrics. So you've got an app, you can see who downloads it, you can see how often they use it. If you've instrumented it well, you can see what features they use. In other industries, you're crossing so many more processes and people that it's much harder to look at the impact of what happens when you make a change. And so what people do as a response is they try and kind of put a lot of metrics onto humans. But we've seen a ton of places where that actually works terribly. And I think Wells Fargo is kind of the classic example of if you incentivize humans to open accounts, they'll open accounts, but that's not actually what you wanted to do.
That whole you make what you measure problem.
Exactly. And I think it's kind of, there's this statement as a customer is, at the end of the day, I just want this thing done. The reality is that's very difficult in a lot of scenarios because I think as a customer, even I, someone who's worked within Microsoft and seen how many systems to come together, I assume that companies have their act together, right? Like surely they can just look something up in a database and they know all the information about me. It's like if I stop and think, I know that's not actually the case. But for most folks, it almost feels like a personal insult if you call your bank and they ask you who you are 3 times. We try and think about at the end of the day, I just want my balance. At the end of the day, I just want my bills paid. It's very difficult to figure out how we would enable that in a world where we're not just dealing with software, we're dealing with processes. And I think one of the other challenges here is that in order to do that, you need to let people use their judgment and to reach beyond what their specific job is and help someone else. And that's a very difficult thing to model and to train people on. I think it's what other industries are going to have to embrace, but it's such a huge change from this notion of, you've got one person who's authorized to do this level of work, and to do anything else they need to go to a manager, and that manager needs to go to a manager. And, you're undoing how companies have been managed.
That command and control structure came into the world for a reason. It was a way to have visibility into what everyone was doing. But we do work with more and more companies where that has outlived its usefulness. And in order to survive, and in particular, in order to compete with digital companies, these corporations have to somehow empower folks to do that reaching outside of their box, to do that taking care of the fundamental task and not just the tasks that are written down for them. But that's so difficult because we have generations of workers who are acculturated to stay inside their boxes.
I think it's not just that, it's also that our way that we've managed, folks are used to being told how instead of why. And so even in very well-meaning corporations who've really tried to embrace employee empowerment culture, it's very easy to default to telling someone, do this, as opposed to do this because And if you understand that because, you have something a lot easier to work with. For example, if I'm trying to get some information on a customer and I go to our privacy counsel and say, can I do this? It's her job to say no if it has any risk of impinging on a customer's privacy. If I go and say, here's why I want to do this thing, then I've empowered this person to say, well, you can't do X or Y, but you could do Z. That would be legal and I would feel comfortable with that. Does that meet your needs? And then you can have a conversation. But that is not something that we've seen modeled. It's something that people have to invent for themselves. And I think, in software companies, you've got this kind of like, we're changing the world ethos, which, for good or bad, sometimes that doesn't go as well as it should. But you do more often see that modeled. And I think that's where in other companies, what they haven't gotten to yet is how do we model that behavior? There was a couple of years ago a big trend of having these innovation centers within companies where we basically said, let's take a bunch of smart people and free them from the bureaucracy and let them work. And in some cases launched, satellite businesses and great things happened. But what you didn't have is that modeling to everyone else. So you'd see this resentment built like, oh, you get to go have the fun job and be far away from the rules.
Yep.
And meanwhile, the rest of us just, keep slogging along. And you think if you'd taken that effort and invested it into everyone is going to learn how to form an experiment, form a hypothesis, try something new in a very small scoped manner, where even if it goes totally awry, it'll be okay. That's the energy that we have to bring to larger corporations to say, we've got to start small. We've got to figure out how we can let this ticket agent do something a little bit different, how we can let this wait person do something a little bit different and actually collect that result and limit the damage if there is damage.
It takes tremendous energy because there is this sense of damage control at that individual level. There is this sense of, if I stay within my lane, then I won't break anything and no one will yell at me. I see a lot of learned helplessness in folks at large organizations where the aversion to taking any kind of risk, even to help the customer, is deeply, deeply ingrained. When you look back on all the work that you've done, what are you proudest of?
I think the thing that makes me incredibly proud is seeing, and get to see the most of it across Microsoft, is seeing people frame questions in a way that will get them actual answers. I see a lot fewer yes-no questions. I see kind of scenario-based questions. Tell me about this. I'll hear people in their interviews, or I'll see things in internal blogs where people are asking open-ended questions or saying, tell me about a time when, or how does this impact instead of does this? And I think that's just amazing that a lot of people they're not necessarily in a workshop with me or talking to me, but have made these little subtle language changes that allow us to get so much more insight out of people and understand what's really going on.
That's fascinating. It is so interesting that even these small changes in how you phrase speculation can point to these deep changes. And I think Microsoft is one of the great success stories of transformation, from a company that at the turn of the millennium was allergic to open source and very much a command and control structure, to the company you see now, which is one of the leading voices in open source. Can you talk a little bit about what it's been like to live through that transformation?
It's very funny because Yammer was acquired by Microsoft towards the very end of Ballmer's tenure. And so I feel like as someone being based in San Francisco who would go up to Redmond at these points of punctuated equilibrium, I could tell the difference between the first time going up where coworkers of mine at Yammer were told to cover up the apple on their laptop. There's a lot of, we don't do that here. That's not the way it's been done. Who are you, little startup, to tell us things? As the CEO transition happened, you've got a lot less of that. And I will always remember there was an all hands where Satya Nadella was up there and he was talking about some app. I don't even remember what it was. And he pulls out an iPhone and he's like, this. And he was talking about a very specific user interaction, a workflow. He's like, this is the sort of thing we need to do. But the fact that he would cite Apple in front of everyone, I think for old timers, that was just a transformative moment.
It is a genuine case study in American corporate history because Ballmer was very much of that generation of East Coast, came from sort of the financial background, that kind of community where he was very, very attuned to what was happening on Wall Street. Whereas Satya, coming up through engineering, super connected with the developer and with the customer, and being a man of color and someone who has a disabled kid, being sensitive sensitive to alternative points of view in that sense as well. It's been really wonderful to watch the change, I have to say.
Like I said, living it from a little bit of a remove, it's fascinating watching that difference. And I think it's, as the CEO, you have very little impact on people's day-to-day activities. You can say experiment, or you can say whatever your command and control is, but people will do what their direct managers incentivize. But what you can really control is the tone. And the top-down tone immediately became, like you said, multiple points of view. There are multiple right answers. We can learn more by asking. We can learn more by reading. We are not the people who are going to tell our customers what they need. And I think there was a time at which Microsoft did that, and that was perhaps the correct thing. In the early stages of computer software, customers didn't know what they wanted, didn't even know it was possible. But now we're at an age where, even though most people don't understand how their iPhones work, they understand that there's a lot of things that are possible. And so we have to go in with that humility and say, look, I know you're not going to give me engineering specs, but you can tell me a lot of detail about what is this thing in your life that's bothering you, that's holding you back from something. And what are you doing as a workaround? Then it's our job to take that insight and figure out how can we, using software or using AI or using whatever our tool of choice is, make that easier for you.
It's interesting that you should mention reading as one of the key inputs, because Microsoft has always been a very curious company. And, I'm one of the people who surprised myself, because 25 years ago, I wouldn't have believed that I would be waiting anxiously for Bill Gates's letter about what he read this year. But that curiosity has already been there. And I wonder if Satya tapped into that in a way that allowed it to come into a new expression.
The thing I said when I first joined Microsoft is that everyone here is just really earnest. They all believe that they are doing the right thing. And some of them, there have been people that I've deeply disagreed with. And some people that I've found very unpleasant, of course, as you would in any large population. They're doing it for a reason. Someone is doing this thing because they want, when you open Microsoft Word, that button to work the way you expect it to work. Or because they fundamentally believe that, this is the way SQL Server should work. And so if you take this population of people who are very smart and very curious and very earnest, you can kind of shape that river to say, like, okay, we're going to flow this way now. We're going to listen a little bit more. The job is still to do the best thing and to, do what you think is right. We're just going to open our minds to, what are more of those sources of what might be right.
If you had one do-over in your career, what would you do differently?
This one is very hard to say, because I think the biggest career mistake I made was also the one that laid the foundation for where I am. So I had been at a software company called Yodlee, which a lot of people know as being what powered Mint.com. I had a great time there. And when the time came for me to move to another company, I chose poorly. I chose a startup that was not great. It didn't have a very strong mission. The founders were very happy about being founders, but didn't really have a good sense of what they wanted to do. And I just, I judge badly. And I got there and I was like, this is a mistake, but I don't have a lot of options right now. It was, a little bit of a downturn time. I was just very frustrated to be in a place where I felt like this is not where I can make change. I probably at that time, since I didn't know what I wanted, should have gone to a larger company where I had more people to learn from. This was also a time when I was making the move from user experience into product management. The ideal thing to do would have been to go find a company with a culture of strong product management and go learn from people there. And I had a little bit of an ego about wanting to be a director of product management at a startup, and that's what I did. On the other hand, being in a company where I fundamentally felt like no matter what I do, this company is going to go down, it gave me a lot of time. I participated in Google groups. Someone had started this Google group called Lean Startup Circle that was kind of interesting. I read 4 Steps to the Epiphany. I started tweeting and blogging more. I met Heaton Shaw at Kissmetric. And that's what led to me writing the book. Because of the things in 4 Steps and the lean startup that really stood out to me was this notion of customer development, of knowing your customers. It was something that I had done in past jobs without having a name for. And suddenly I had a name for this. On the one hand, I wouldn't have taken that job. On the other hand, who knows where I would be today.
That's a fascinating story. And it points, I think, to one of the challenges that corporations have, which is that you do need a certain amount of cognitive surplus to take on that exploratory spirit and to expand your horizons that way. To be able to ask open-ended questions, you have to come from a place of feeling that your basic needs are, if not satisfied, at least, on hold for now, so that you can spend some time doing something else.
I love that phrase, cognitive surplus. And I feel like that's one of the reasons that I've been incredibly happy to be at Microsoft, which, you said about 25 years ago, you never would have believed waiting for something Microsoft related. Same. I've been an Apple diehard all my computing life. Microsoft as a company was not 25 years ago a place where I ever would have envisioned myself. But in today's Microsoft, one, that's changed. And two, as such a large company, there is a lot of room for people to take that cognitive surplus time to be someone who could invest in learning and teaching. And, when I was at Yammer, that was part of my job, is just going up to Microsoft and figuring out which teams were ready to adopt some of the engineering practices that we had adopted, which teams were ready to do customer development, to think experimentally. And that's continued to be part of my purview. Even GitHub is a standalone company. I still have relationships with teams within Microsoft. And there's still that sense of you have your job. And also, if you can invest 10% of your time in making some other team smarter, as a company, we'll reap the benefits of that overall. It's like, don't worry about it. Google 20% time is this kind of mythical thing that people praise and that, a lot of Googlers say doesn't quite exist. And I don't think that as a notion, like everyone gets 20%, makes any sense. But as a company and as a team, recognizing that there are times when if you let someone invest this 20%, it will bring you back tremendous returns. Having that faith will lead to really great things.
And it does take a certain cognitive surplus on the part of leadership as well. There has to be self-confidence in their own leadership. There has to be confidence in the team that what the team is investing non-directed time in will pay off over time. So it's a privilege, I think, that belongs to companies that aren't under imminent financial stress. It's much harder to carve out that space when a company is in an industry that's extremely competitive or that's undergoing a lot of transition.
Yeah.
We've talked about a few things, but is there anything else you think contributes to how difficult corporate innovation is? I've talked about it being the highest difficulty level for playing the innovation game.
It is, absolutely. And I think what makes it so difficult is that there are so many, I've talked before about people and processes and pieces, and the downstream effects are not always visible to you. So if you're in a small company and you decide you're going to do something different, and in doing so, you have inadvertently made life much harder for your product marketing team. They sit a few cubicles over. Maybe in today's era, they're one Zoom call away, but you know them by name. They know who you are. They know who to come to and say, hey, this change you made is killing us. Why did you do it? How can we work this out? In a corporation, a change you make is often invisible. You don't know who that person is that it's impacting downstream. Again, learned helplessness. You mentioned that phrase. It's another thing that I talk about a lot is if it's hard for you to find who to talk to, if it's hard for you to figure out what are even the questions I should ask, you often won't. Because fundamentally humans hate feeling dumb. We just will do anything to prevent it. That's where cognitive bias comes in. That's where a lot of people being really mindlessly cruel comes in. We just really, really don't want to feel foolish. And so in that small company, you can do these kind of micro explorations where if I have an idea, I can kind of say, hey, what do you think about this thing to my neighbor over the cubicle or that I've got on Slack DM? And I can wait and see, do they immediately shoot it down? Do they ask a question? Do they give me kind of a polite demurral? And based on that, I can decide, do I want to build up this idea a little bit more and polish it and share it to another person? In a corporation, sure, you still have your work buddy, but the person who can actually tell you if this is a good idea or not, you might not know who they are. Or you might know who they are, but not have that relationship where you feel like you can say, I'm going to ask for 15 minutes of your day, and I don't have anything for you in return, and no, you've never met me. I just figured out that you're probably that person. That's very awkward.
And awkwardness is almost worse than feeling dumb, that social hesitance. But there is this real need for the ability to reach across hierarchical lines, where in a corporation, a lot of the teams have formed this defensive posture where they bond over saying, oh, well, that's an IT problem. And those idiots down in IT, they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah. The directors told us to do this. I don't know why they want this thing. It's a very defensive us versus them. I talked about modeling before. This is another place where it is very difficult and it feels almost silly, like common sense, like, oh, you shouldn't have to do this, but you absolutely do. What does it look like to cold outreach to another team that you don't don't know and ask a question? How do you frame it so that it feels like less of a burden to them, so it feels non-threatening? How do you set up this expectation that they will respond to you? And I think even pre-Satya, Microsoft had a culture of informational interviews where it was basically expected that if someone asked you for 30 minutes to find out about your team or about what you were working on, that you would grant it in good grace, because the expectation was you're going to be here for a lifetime. That's another thing that big companies have, is you have people who are there for a long time, and so they know that any investment they pay out, they'll get back. And so that culture was there. On a micro level, I think GitHub uses a Slack plugin called Donut, and it's this little thing that facilitates chats between random people who have joined a Slack channel. And what that does at this level is basically normalize having a 20-minute conversation with someone you don't know. Like, it gives you a prompt. It reminds you to set up the time. Everyone's opted in because they've joined this Slack channel. And I think that's like a little tiny thing that's a model of like, here's how to talk to someone you don't already know. And you think about at a company, how many of those you could do in a way that would facilitate this communication? How do you disagree with a manager? How do you politely say, I don't know why you suggested that. It doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe you've got context I don't. There's a way to say that where it works, where you actually come across in good faith and you get that answer. And there's a way where you told, stay within your lines and go back to work. And I think that knowledge, we assume it exists, but it really doesn't. It's like, if you're a kid who, lived in a remote area, you don't necessarily have the skills to make friends built in. You don't necessarily have the skills for disagreeing across team lines or asking a manager why they've proposed this crazy thing. That's really fundamental to all of this. If you're going to trust someone, you have to give them the tools to do something. It's like you wouldn't send someone out to chop down a tree with a rusty knife. How do we bring customer development? How do we bring customer centricity into a company? The first thing you have to recognize is that your first line of customers is internal.
It's not enough just to have a visionary, innovative leader, because there's this layer underneath the C-suite that has the responsibility for executing. If those folks are just like hunkering down and waiting for this new leader to fail and for the old regime to reassert itself, then no matter how inspired people are at the individual contributor layer, they run into this wall of resistance from management that is death to any innovation project.
And just things like this is an expectation or this is a trade-off, because whenever change comes, you can't just add it on top of what you were already doing. Most people's jobs are pretty full up. And so if you say, like, do all the stuff you've been doing and then spend 10% of time on innovation, that's going to be the first thing to go. It's, last on, first off. If instead you say, like, let's look at what everyone's doing today and like throw out these things that no longer serve us well. And every company, no matter if you're a tiny startup to a giant company, you have things that you started doing and at the time they were the right solution and they're no longer serving you well. And you can X them off your task list. And if you're very honest about saying, let's stop doing the things that are making a difference, then you free up some time. And so at a leadership level, the CEO is not going to do that. But someone a couple levels down needs to be saying, in order to do this, we've got to take some things off. So let's think about what things we can take off the stack. And having that conversation at multiple levels helps facilitate that. It helps make everyone feel more confident, like, okay, I can do this because I'm not doing some other thing. And, a lot of the times that stuff that we shouldn't be doing, people are happy to get rid of it. Most humans at any level recognize when something they're doing is pointless. And it's kind of a relief to say, oh, thank goodness. I never understood why we were doing this in the first place. And now I have the grace to kind of say, I don't think this makes sense. Let's stop.
I have seen the unfortunate converse situation, though, where people are incredibly invested in their zombie projects, and people have tried to kill the zombie projects, but they keep coming back up out of the earth. And it's very, very difficult to build consensus for stopping doing something in a large corporation. This cargo cult belief that if we just keep doing things, we'll be okay.
And again, that's another modeling behavior, is like, have you ever seen a thing killed where people got a reward afterwards, right? And it's like, I almost feel like as leadership, you have to pick something to be your sacrificial lamb that you can then praise. And what we're used to seeing is, I had a project. It was really great. I launched it. Everyone told me I was fantastic. I'm going to get a promotion. And then we've seen the reverse of, oh, someone was working on the project got killed, and some people got laid off. Or some people who were leading a project are now a non-leader on some other thing that they didn't want to do. That's a bad ending. I think we can actually orchestrate happy endings where you can look for something and kill it, and then talk about that in all hands about how great is it that this thing was not yielding the results we wanted. It was in fact wasting people's time. And so we've killed it, and we've taken everyone who has worked on it and we have let them do their pet project, or we have put them on this new shining thing that is the hope of the company. It doesn't have to be a major release, but even like a small thing of, this team pointed out that the way they were doing this meeting wasn't serving them any well. They've taken on a new way of doing this meeting or keeping track of this customer thing, and everyone is happier now. And I'd like to really congratulate them for doing that.
It's a great idea to start with meetings because there is no gift to anyone more beautiful than we're going to cancel this meeting and give you back your time in perpetuity.
Yeah.
This afternoon is yours now.
And meetings are such short-term things that I think a lot of times the notion of permanent change is terrifying. The notion of an experiment, even if you hate the experiment, is a lot more bearable. Because at some level, even if you're a skeptic who doesn't want change, you're thinking, well, in 3 weeks, I will be proven right. And that allows you to go along with this. Okay, we're not going to have this meeting, or we're going to change the format of this meeting. We're going to try it for 3 weeks and see what everyone thinks. And that's a very short-term experiment. And people will sign on to that more readily than they will from now on, we are making this change.
Cindy, you've had so much amazing experience across so many industries. How would you distill all of this into 2 or 3 lessons for our listeners?
Oh gosh, let's see. I think the first thing is start with why. There's a great book, Simon Sinek, that goes into this in detail, but think like, why are we doing this? Make it normalized for anyone to ask why. And again, this is where having kind of a formal set of words can help, because blurting out why often comes across as kind of accusatory, but say, hey, in this company, we always want to make sure we understand why we're doing things. And if you're ever in a room where you don't understand why, it is okay to say, hang on a sec, can we take a step back? I want to make sure I understand why we're doing this. And everyone in the room should respond with good grace. Starting with that gets you so far. There's so many times I've come into a room, someone has asked that, and everyone has realized, oh, we're not really sure. Or we started out on this path and we've made some changes and we're not sure that we ever realigned. So like starting with why, making it okay for everyone to ask why. The other, I think, is always thinking about that at the end of the day, or I sometimes will say, like, think about the customer saying, so what? So anything you're doing, whether it's an internal change around process or how you do things, or it's an external change, think about that stakeholder who hasn't put the time and effort into planning it. All they're seeing is the end result. And they're thinking to themselves, so what? Why do I care? It's like, if you make something 5% better, that is an improvement. And also, the customer is probably thinking, so I guess it's a little faster. What's the big deal? And sometimes that means that maybe you shouldn't invest in making something 5% better. Like, that sounds terrible on its face, but honestly, there's probably something with a much higher yield that you could do. You could, take away a feature that allows someone to more confidently make a choice, because now there's not that, wait, should I choose that option? Maybe it's streamlining a process. Maybe it's taking a completely new track, but taking that, so what? And always thinking about it from that skeptic's eye. And a lot of times that's helpful to do within yourself. While you should always get outside of the building and listen to other people, it's a lot faster when you can train yourself to say, okay, I'm going to so what this. And the best tool I found for that is reading things out loud. Anything you've written, anything you plan to say it out loud. And you will notice, like, wow, that sounds like weird corporate jargon. And everyone who hears it is going to, okay, let me rewrite this. And finally, the improv, yes and, but makes people defensive. It makes people close up. Yes and is magical when you can stop and say, yes, and also, here's one of the things that makes that difficult, but how might this still work? Or yes, even if blah, blah, blah. Yes, I hear you, and then the detail. Because then people keep listening. And when someone suggests something, and maybe it's not a possible or a good idea, everything goes more smoothly when they come to that realization themselves. And yes and is such a powerful tool for getting people to that realization themselves. Or getting you to say yes and, oh, actually, no, that's a great idea. It wasn't my idea, which is why I immediately, I'm a human, I immediately rejected it because it wasn't my idea. But now that I've said yes and thought about it, actually, yeah, you're right. We should do that. And I think when we have those, when we practice those, magic things happen.
These are fabulous lessons. But what's striking to me about all 4 of them is that they're, drawing on history and context and rhetoric and theater. What you're talking about are a lot of soft skills that come from the liberal arts. And I don't know whether you saw, but the creator of 8chan was saying, as a 19-year-old building a software service, I sure wish I'd known who Karl Popper is and what the paradox paradox of tolerance is.
Yeah.
How do you think the pandemic might affect corporations in the long term?
It's very interesting the degree to which the FaceTime myth has crumbled.
Yes.
And I think to some degree there will be people who can't wait to get back to offices. I personally can't wait to have a space when I'm not going to be interrupted with requests for mac and cheese or whatever else.
Lighting a candle for all of the parents of young kids in this time. It's
Yes.
Thank you for your service.
But also I think there's the myth that having people in the same space all the time is necessary. There's been a ton of really good collaboration, and I think a lot where, because time has bled into evenings and weekends, and that part is not great, because things are more amorphous in time, where I've seen happen is that instead of a decision getting made at the end of a 60-minute meeting, because everyone's going to shuffle off to their next meeting, but maybe there wasn't the right amount of information, or maybe the loudest voice in the room just made it. I've seen things where a decision gets left open-ended, and then someone trickles back in at 8 p.m. and is like, hey, I was thinking about it more, and I wonder if we could do this thing instead. And I think like the freedom to set work down and go do something else and come back to it is tremendous. And you know, right now it's not under the greatest circumstance, because probably what you set your work down and go do is some laundry, or you feed a kid, or you watch Netflix and try and like ward off the crushing existential doom. The notion that intellectual work should be 9 to 5 has always seemed odd to me. And if you look at, you know, again, going back to history, you look at great inventors, they weren't sitting in their workshop from 9 to 5. They were getting up late and thinking about something, or going out and wandering outside and seeing an apple fall from a tree or a bird flying in the air, and it's like, oh, that is a principle I can bring back into my work. And so I think the notion of like, let's let people work at the time when they're most able to work is very powerful. I would expect to see a lot more flexibility in terms of, sure, we have this office, maybe you come into the office a couple days a week, and the other time you work in a way that's more constructive to you.
Yeah, I think we need to have a lot more conversations about work-life balance, because the quid pro quo to being on Slack at 8 p.m. means you have to have downtime at 3 p.m. And that has to be understood. You know, the unions worked for 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for what you will. We've lost sight of that basic human need for open-ended, non-directed time.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I've tried really hard to model is, you know, in my Slack profile at work, it has a very clear link to my work schedule. And it's like, I go offline from 3 to 9. Like, that is non-negotiable. I have kids. I get up early, but like, I'm off at these times. At a past time, it was a different, like, middle of the day chunk. Nope, not going to do it. You can't schedule me for meetings. I will decline them. You know, as a leader, I want to do that and normalize it. Like, yes, I might be working on a Sunday one day, but that's because I was homeschooling a kid from 12 to 4, or that's because, you know, I took this time off. And I mean, again, it comes down to trusting people. If you have people who are interested in something and they understand why they're doing it and they understand the importance of it, most of them will get it done.
It's a fundamental philosophical point, though. I mean, some people believe people are basically well-meaning and hardworking, and that they will contribute and build something even if you're not coercing them 24/7. And other people just genuinely don't believe that. They believe people are lazy, and if you're not like surveilling them, they won't do anything. And it's very hard to persuade those people to take a risk and trust their folks.
Why can't it be both? Like the meme says, right? Like, human, we are fundamentally lazy. There are times when we don't want to do things. I would say, okay, well, when that's true, let's look at that. Let's like to take that as a given. When is that true? Yeah, I'm not going to discount there will always be some people who are just never motivated, in the same way that there will always be some people who are incredibly, incredibly motivated and, you know, work 16-hour days, or, you know, are constantly thinking. So, but let's look at that. Let's say, okay, if we have times when workers are being lazy and the only way to get them to do something is to, you know, watch them and crack the whip, then why is that? Talk to them, figure out why is that? Is it because the work they're doing doesn't make sense to them? Is it because they'd rather be doing something else? Is it because they don't understand why this thing is important? I mean, I think you're never going to solve for everything, but you can solve for so much by understanding why this thing doesn't make sense. And when I was at Yammer, I remember we did some research on retail workers, for whatever reason, people who worked in mall retail. They would talk about their jobs, and they were pretty much, you know, clock watching 9 to 5, like, I have this job because it pays the rent and that's it. And in talking about parts of their job that they enjoyed and didn't enjoy, the parts that they were like, oh, I hate this, were very much like they didn't make sense. They were things that were, oh, well, I have to do this way, this thing with the equipment, blah, blah, blah. Like, oh, well, can you tell me why you have to do it? Well, I don't actually know. In all the time I've been here, no one has ever explained it. It doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't seem like it's doing any good. All I know is if I don't check this box, someone yells at me. And I think like that, I'm not going to be super eager to do that either. And it was also that if I do a good job at this, I don't get any praise. If I don't do it, I get yelled at. And also, if I do it half-heartedly, it doesn't seem to make a difference. So why wouldn't I just do it half-heartedly?
50 years of research into animal training, and we've clearly established negative reinforcement doesn't work, but it hasn't trickled through to human management yet.
I know. It's like, it's yes and. Like, yes, these people are being lazy and they won't do what you've tasked them with unless you threaten them. And let's understand why that is. Does this make sense? Is there another model?
How do you personally avoid burnout?
I have children, and that means that I have no option to work too much because, especially now, they will physically pull me away from that. I have always worked better as a bursty sort of person. And so while I don't like being in my house all the time, the pandemic is actually, kind of aligned with my work style anyways, which is like some days I will get a ton done and it'll be a huge step forward. And some days I'm like, I don't really know what I accomplished here. And that happens on the week scale as well. So if I am not being productive, then I just won't work. I'll be like, I'll do the meetings that are absolutely necessary. I'll do what my team needs to keep going. And then I'll just like call a mulligan on today because I know there's no point. And again, I'm glad that I have the freedom to do that. I wish more teams and leaders would recognize that tendency in humans. If you have a job where you've got to change someone's IV medicine or you've got to sell the tickets, then you've got to do it. But when you have intellectual work, like you're not always going to have good intellectual days. And sitting there and trying to make it happen is just burning out something that we don't have an endless capacity for. It's like, burning out this energy that it is not boundless. And so it's like, you know what? You're not doing great work today. Forget it. Go for a walk. We should all do that more.
It's such a pleasure to hear you talk about the kids because I really felt that my career kicked into high gear when I had children and I was working fewer hours, but they were way more directed because I really just wanted to get back to the kids. And everything I was doing had this much more visceral point to it. It was helping to build my children's future. So,
and it made me ask why about everything I did.
Exactly.
Like, why am I doing this? Is this important? If I don't do this, will bad things happen? And I culled so many senseless things from my list because I was like, this is not actually the most valuable thing I could be doing.
Yeah, you don't work as performatively anymore. You're just like, is this more important than reading a bedtime story? It is not, So.
And there's actually really interesting research about this, that people average your accomplishments. And so if you've done like an amazing thing and an amazing thing and two like middling things, you actually seem less impressive than someone who just did two amazing things.
Yes.
And there's been really interesting research in people's resumes around this. Like if you've got the great bullet points and then the meh bullet point, it drags you down. And I think the same thing is true in intellectual work is, doing those middling things actually doesn't make you seem better. If anything, it's hurting you. So like we really should be incentivized to do the best things and the most important things. And that doesn't mean they're always going to be the things we like. There's certainly things I do where I'm like, I don't think this makes any sense, but my boss is really big on it. But if I'm going to do that thing, I'm going to do it in the best way that I know. And I'm going to think as much about the outcome as like, okay, I don't think this makes sense, but I think the desired outcome is this. And so I'm going to work as hard as possible to get that desired outcome so that I can cross this off my list and go back to, doing things with the kids or whatever else is my priority.
I sometimes think that being middle class is just all about internalizing deferred gratification. If we can just pay this mortgage for 30 years, then we'll own the house free and clear. If we can just put in the work now, then there'll be a payoff later. What is the best way for our listeners to connect or follow your work?
I tweet pretty regularly on Twitter at Cindy Alvarez. I have to admit the blogging has fallen off a bit since I've been in quarantine. You can also just email me. I get random questions. People reach out via LinkedIn or cindy@cindyalvarez.com. And I do actually really enjoy hearing from people about what they're trying to do. Or, honestly, if someone comes to me and says, here's my problem, I'm trying to ask this of customers, it doesn't seem to be working. I really love diagnosing those because it's a short thing where I've seen the pattern so many times that I probably know what you should try. I'm happy to share that wisdom. A lot of times people are a little bit shy about contacting folks who have done a lot of work in an area area, like, oh, this is going to be seen as free consulting they're probably too busy. But the truth is that problems that we've solved a lot of times are very satisfying because I can solve it quickly for you. And whatever else I have facing me in my day is probably more complex. So someone who sends me a terrible customer development script and I'm like, oh, okay, these are the 3 things you need to fix. Boom, boom, boom. Like, I can rattle that off and send it. And I feel like, wow, I did this thing in 90 seconds and I probably saved that person 3 weeks worth of work.
Is there going to be a new edition of Lean Customer Development?
I don't know that there's much I would change. It's one of those things where, 2014, my personal bias is if I see a tech book that's more than 3 years old, I don't trust it. And so I've read it at 3-year intervals to see, like, does this still hold up? And I think it's so fundamentally about how humans behave that, with the exception of things like, no, you probably can't recruit people off Craigslist effectively anymore. Otherwise it's pretty solid. So I don't know what I would put in a second edition. I do think there's probably another book in me about kind of some of those generalizations about, okay, so here's how you talk to your customers. A lot of your customers are your coworkers. It's your manager. It's the people on your team. It's that team over there that always seems like they don't get it. If you can work with these folks, you can apply some of the same techniques, and not all, because they know you, they know where you work, but how can you take some of these questions you'd ask of customers and apply them internally, whether it's a tiny project or a large scale enterprise change project? So I think that's really kind of the direction I'm heading in now is, you're using a lot of the same questions, a lot of the same principles, but there are nuances. And I think being within Microsoft, even GitHub is a pretty good sized company. It's taking those questions and applying them with the right nuance to use them internally.
That one sounds really powerful. I will definitely pre-order it. Okay, now I'm going to give you a magic wand. You get to dictate what happens in the next 10 years. And in 10 years' time, the industry, the software industry, let's say, is exactly as you would like it to be. What does it look like?
Wow, that's a good magic wand question. Okay, let's see. So the software industry has gained a lot of humility. We still have incredibly smart people who have a great reality distortion field impact, but a lot of the source of what are the problems is coming from outside. I think if there's been one thing that's been frustrating to watch is the immense amounts of talent thrown at problems that are not that useful, that don't have that much impact, or that have impact on a very specialized population. And I recognize I'm one of the beneficiaries of this population, like being someone who lives in a city with a high income and very tech savvy. There are so many things that serve me, but there's so much more out there. And I think the notion of wanting that so what to be bigger and more impactful over just glamorizing the technology. Like, I think that's where I would want things to be, is that software has an incredibly democratic entry point. Anyone can learn to code. Anyone can learn low code or no code solutions. And embracing people who've come from non-traditional backgrounds means that the flow of problems coming in is not so constrained. You've got people coming from, my dad is running a dental office that's barely scraping by, and this is how this solution I built has made his business better. I grew up in a family with 8 kids, and we were always, running out of things, and here's a solution I found that makes this better. I have a brother with autism, and here's something that made his life better. Bringing in that wider scope of solutions and recognizing that while there are some things that require vast amounts of computing complexity, like the way that Google Maps knows how fast the speed limit is exactly where I'm driving. Tons of engineering went into that. Amazing. And also something that makes a glorified Airtable for a busy parent or a school administrator who's trying to educate kids with different needs so much more impact. So I would love to see that, more voices building the solutions and more voices talking about what the problems are, and a recognition that's a more glamorized thing. And I think what comes along with that is probably a change in venture capital, because it rewards the 100x return. And I don't think that's ever going to go away. But if I had my magic wand and I could make things be away, it would be that there are a larger bank of investors who say, hey, a 5x investment is pretty great. And I'm going to invest in more things that are mission driven because I'm not actually making my fortune off this. Maybe I'm a software person and I'm an angel investor, and I have more information and more access to say, this is a solution that's after my own heart. Even if it makes 2x returns, I'm going to be happier that it's in the world, and I will have created jobs, and I will end up richer. And I think that opens the door for so many things, because there's so many businesses that are never going to be 100x, and yet they could make so many people's lives better.
That sounds like an awesome software industry. I would like to work there. For listeners who may not be aware, the startup that was started by a founder whose brother has autism is real, and it's one of the Alchemist portfolio companies. So
excellent.
Did you know that, Cindy?
I did not. I was just but that's it's a use case of something that is, if you live it, and I don't have anyone close to me with autism, but obviously I have a lot of coworkers, Microsoft, tech industry in general. It's like so many things. If you live it, the complexities so in and out. And if you have figured out the thing that works, and I'll generalize that to parenting. If you have a kid with like a weird quirk and you have figured out this thing that works, then it makes such a huge difference. And so if you can band together these little like tribes of people with a very specific problem and solve that for them, it's life-changing what you can do. So I'm glad though that actually exists.
Is there anything else that I should have asked you that we didn't already cover?
Let's see. I got to answer a magic wand question. I got to talk about yes and. I'm not sure. I think this is actually pretty good.
That's high praise coming from you, Cindy. Thank you so much. It's been such a delight to have you on the show. It's so great to spend time with another badass mom making waves. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners will as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been Alchemist X, Innovators Inside. If you enjoy our show, we'd be grateful if you could give us a rating or comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can find the transcript of this conversation, plus links to whatever books, articles, TV shows, and apps we talked about on alchemistaccelerator.com/podcasts. If you'd like to chat more about our corporate programs for spin-ins and spin-outs, email us at innovators@alchemistaccelerator.com. We love hearing from you, so stay connected by following Alchemist X on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Until next time, this has been Alchemist X, Innovators Inside.